Most 6-year-olds spend their summers racing across sandy beaches, their joyous shouts lost in the roar of the waves, or sitting for hours in a state of a pure, unadulterated bliss, coloring their favorite dinosaur pictures. But Liam Harper isn't most children. He hasn't spoken a single solitary word in the 9 long and very silent months since he stood by his own mother's grave, watching as her casket was slowly and with a terrible and very final finality lowered into the cold, dark earth. In the grand coastal home where the waves crash, a steady and very lonely rhythm beyond the massive plate glass windows, and where the bright morning sunlight bounces off every single, a sterile white wall, a deep and very profound silence seeps into every single solitary corner. We often think that our children need big, expensive solutions to heal. But sometimes, what a hurting child needs the most is far, far simpler. Before this incredible story begins, ask yourself this one simple question. What do you think is the most important thing a grieving child needs to begin to heal? Daniel Harper, Liam's father, a renowned and very successful interior architect, chooses to work far more than is necessary. For him, grief is a storm you can outrun if you just sign enough contracts, if you just design enough beautiful and very empty spaces, if you just fill enough of the long and very lonely hours of the day. But every single evening, Daniel steps back into a quiet so deep, so profound that even his own expensive footsteps echo cold and hollow on the polished marble floors. Liam is usually in his room, the door always, and for some reason, just slightly ajar, a faint and very lonely glow of a television screen spilling out into the dark and very empty hallway. But there are no words. There is no laughter. There is just a silent and very heavy presence. It isn't the silence of a peace. It is the silence of the empty spaces that no one in this house has dared to touch. Daniel has tried everything. It's the best and most expensive child psychologists, the most renowned and most sought-after pediatricians, the short and the long, and the very, very expensive therapy sessions, specially designed and very useless communication games. And yet every single solitary attempt has ended in the exact same and very frustrating way. In silence, Liam doesn't resist, but he doesn't respond either. And every single day, Daniel tells himself that he is doing his best for his son. But somewhere deep down in a place he does not want to look, he knows that he is running too. Because to face Liam's silence, it would mean that he would have to face his own very profound loss. And he is not sure, not yet, that he is ready or even able to do that. He wasn't even supposed to be home that day, his 3-day, and very important business trip to Boston had been canceled at the very last minute when a major and very difficult client had postponed. He hadn't told his assistant. He hadn't messaged anyone in the house. Be a small and very tired part of him had just wanted to walk through his own front door into a familiar and very quiet space where no one was, waiting for him where no one was asking him any questions. On the long and very silent drive back from the airport, he had pictured the usual and very sad scene, cold and very empty front hall, the sound of the ocean, a muffled and very distant roar behind the thick soundproof glass, and Liam, his beautiful and very broken Liam, in his room, silent as a small and very lonely ghost. But today, as the heavy front door had closed behind him, Daniel had heard something else. Laughter at first. It was faint, like a distant, a very beautiful echo from a long and very forgotten memory. But then it grew clearer, it grew more alive, and it struck him, square in the chest, with the force of a physical blow. A child's laughter, loud, unrestrained, and completely and utterly free. He froze, his own heart skipping a beat. It couldn't be Liam, not the Liam who hadn't laughed like that in 9 long very empty months, leaving his expensive leather suitcase in the entryway. Daniel had followed the sound down the long and very silent hallway to the glass-walled garden room at the very back of the house. And what he saw there made him forget how to breathe. Liam, his Liam, was riding on the back of a woman, his small and now very happy, hands gripping her shoulders, his entire small body shaking with a pure and very beautiful and very real laughter. The woman was on all fours, on the soft, white, and very expensive rug, moving like a playful, very silly pony, her long brown hair tied back with a few stray strands falling loose around her happy and very beautiful face. It was Clara Evans, the part-time and very quiet housekeeper he had hired, only to keep the place tidy, to cook the simple and very healthy meals, and to remain, for the most part, completely and utterly invisible. During her very brief and very professional interview, he hadn't asked much about her. He hadn't cared about her past. It was just a short-term and very convenient arrangement. And yet here she was, not only breaking the house's unspoken and very sacred rule of a quiet and very respectful silence, but she was shattering the thick and very impenetrable wall that had been built around his son's very broken and very silent heart. Liam's laughter came in great joyous bursts, punctuated by small happy gasps for breath, while Clara, the maid, neighed, so dramatically and so beautifully, shaking her shoulders, so that he would just laugh and laugh harder. Daniel stood in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid that the slightest and most insignificant of sounds would make the beautiful and very fragile moment vanish. This wasn't just a simple childish laughter. This was life. This was life returning. The boy in front of him wasn't the Liam of the past 9 long and very silent months. He was the Liam from before everything had so completely and so brutally fallen apart. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, a ghost in his own home, watching a scene he thought he would never witness again. The boy in front of him wasn't the Liam of the past 9 months. He was the Liam from before everything fell apart. When Liam finally looked up and saw his father standing there, his smile, the ghost of a smile, still intact, Daniel felt his own knees weaken. His son, who for nearly a year had not spoken, not smiled, not moved like this, was now walking toward him, his small steps a little shaky, but certain. He wrapped his small arms around his father's leg and buried his face into the expensive fabric of his trousers as if he had never been hurt at all. Daniel lowered himself onto the bench beneath the ivy-covered arch, and Liam gradually calmed, his small fingers unconsciously stroking the fabric of his father's shirt. 1,000 burning questions rushed through his mind. How did she do this? Why now? What had this woman, this stranger, this maid, done that so many of the world's most expensive specialists had so completely and so spectacularly failed to do? But when he looked up at her, at Clara, the words wouldn't come. She was now sitting opposite him, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as though this moment, this miraculous, life-faltering moment, carried none of the immense and very real weight for her that it did for him. Daniel clenched his jaw, his own hand now trembling slightly as he held his son. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to chalk it all up to a simple, random luck or a strange and very convenient coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. This woman, this quiet, unassuming woman, had just found the road into his son's silent and very broken world, a place where he, his own father, had long since lost the map. And she had done it by doing less, by simply being there, and she had brought back something that he had thought had been buried forever with his wife. Daniel wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet. But the thought, the powerful and very revolutionary thought, clung to him the entire next day as he moved, quietly and with a new and very different kind of an attention. Through his own coastal house, like a ghost who was just beginning to remember how to live, he kept waiting for the miracle to vanish, for Liam to retreat once again back into the safe and very lonely fortress of his silence. But it didn't happen. Liam followed Clara around the house like a small silent shadow. He was still quiet, yes, but he was alert, he was observant, and he was, for the very first time, present. He didn't speak, but he responded. When Clara would hum a soft, simple tune as she worked, he would tap out the rhythm with his small, delicate fingers on the tabletop. When she would ask him to choose a color for his afternoon drawing, he would, with a quiet and very deliberate purpose, point. And when she would sit on the floor to read, he would sit beside her. Daniel watched from a distance, careful not to disturb the fragile and very beautiful trust that seemed to be growing so slowly and so organically between them. Clara never acted as if she noticed him there. She didn't perform for him. She didn't narrate their progress the way the other more expensive therapists had. She simply stayed with Liam. And that quiet, simple act of a pure and very unconditional presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. He realized then that he himself did not know how to just be with his own son. But Clara did, passionlessly. She didn't see Liam as a problem to be solved. She saw him as a person who was just waiting, so patiently, to be heard. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself watching Clara more and more closely, not in the suspicious and very critical way of someone who is supervising an employee, but like a man who is searching for an answer to a question he has never been able to grasp. Clara never sat across from Liam with the brightly colored flashcards or the thick, intimidating notebooks that were meant to track his progress. She didn't fire off a series of probing and very useless questions, or dangle the cheap and very meaningless rewards for his compliance. Instead, she was just ... present, in a way so simple, so profound, that it felt almost impossible. In the mornings, Daniel would see them in the kitchen. Clara would be cutting fruit into clumsy, yet very imaginative shapes. A banana bent into the long, graceful neck of a giraffe, slices of a bright red strawberry arranged to form the delicate and very beautiful wings of a butterfly. And Liam would be standing beside the counter, silent, his own beautiful, dark eyes following her every single solitary move. It wasn't sarcastic, but the words, so simple and so true, landed in him like a jolt. He couldn't remember the last time he had ever expected a smile from his own son. Clara didn't treat silence as a problem to be solved. She treated it as its own language, something worth listening to. When Liam handed her a leaf, she accepted it as if it were a precious gift. When he sat beside her, she didn't rush to fill the quiet with questions. Daniel began to realize that Liam wasn't responding because someone was trying to help him. He was responding because someone had accepted him exactly as he was in the afternoons. Daniel often stood in the doorway to the living room, watching. As Liam and Clara sat on the floor, piecing together a puzzle or coloring, Clara didn't narrate their activities for him, nor did she try to showcase any of her skills. She simply existed there with Liam, as if time had no urgency. What unsettled Daniel the most was the gentleness of it all. He had tried every proper and very expensive method to pull his son out of his shell, and he had failed. Clara, with nothing but her own quiet presence, was opening doors he had long since believed were sealed shut. One evening, as Clara and Liam sat reading, Daniel heard her spinning a tale about a fox who taught math in the forest. Liam said nothing, but his eyes lit up with every turn of the story. Clara didn't need him to answer in words. She could read his response in the way that he watched her. Daniel understood then what Clara was doing wasn't fixing. It was being with someone without, turning them into a project. And perhaps that was something that he himself never managed to do for his own son. That afternoon, while she was gathering the laundry from the hampers that were scattered along the second-floor hallway, Clara noticed a small and very playful trail of balled-up socks. She bent down to pick them up, and she followed the trail, a small, curious smile on her own face. And she saw Liam, at the far end of the hall, playing a quiet and very solitary game of a laundry basketball. One of his missed throws had sent a single, small sock skidding far down the hall, slipping with a silent and very final grace. Under the door at the very end, Clara walked over and she tried the handle. It was locked. That was strange, because every other room in this vast and very open house was always open. She pressed her ear to the cold, hard wood of the door, but she heard nothing. No hum of a ventilation, no quiet rhythmic ticking of a clock, just a dense and very heavy and very unmoving stillness. Later that evening, as she was pouring a glass of orange juice for Liam in the kitchen, Clara asked Daniel, her own voice, a casual and very non-threatening sound. "The room at the very end of the upstairs hall. What's in there?" The moment the question had left her lips, Daniel's own handsome face had shifted, as if someone had just, in that one single solitary moment, switched off all the lights inside him. He didn't answer her right away. He just stared down at the polished wooden countertop as though he were facing a deep and very dark and very unrepairable crack in the very foundation of his own very fragile world. "And then," he said, his own voice a low and very final sound, "nobody goes in there." Late that night, after Liam was asleep, Clara sat on the floor of her room, her own cold tea long since forgotten, the memories of her own very painful silences. Rose, unbidden. She knew that a silence doesn't protect you from the pain. It only buries it deeper. She didn't intend to force Daniel to face it, not yet. But she believed in the small, gentle reminders, in the quiet, simple signals that a door does not have to stay shut forever. She went to the kitchen. She warmed a glass of milk, the way her own grandmother used to do for her after her nightmares, and she took a small, simple piece of paper. In a few, plain and very beautiful words, she wrote, "You do not have to open it. Just do not keep it closed forever." She placed the milk and the note directly in front of the locked door, aligning them neatly, and then she walked away without knocking. By morning, the milk was gone. The note had vanished. Daniel said nothing about it. But that evening, when they had crossed paths in the hallway, Clara had noticed that his shoulders were a little less rigid, his eyes a touch softer, and she hadn't said a word. Sometimes the deepest and most profound changes begin with the very smallest of gestures. One afternoon, while Clara was folding a basket of a warm, clean laundry on the living room sofa, Liam sat on the floor, rummaging through an old plastic bin that was tucked away in the corner. It was a bin that was filled with the forgotten odds and ends of his own, very short and now very fractured childhood. Toy cars with missing wheels, dried-out markers, and a few old books with cracked and very well-loved spines. A faint and very mechanical clicking sound made Clara look up. She saw Liam, holding a small black object in his hands, his small, curious fingers pressing its buttons. She walked over and knelt down beside him. "What did you find?" she asked. Her own voice as light and as gentle as a breeze, Liam turned it over in his hands. It was an old voice recorder, the kind that ran on AA batteries, its plastic faded with age. Clara opened the battery cover and found a pair of old, corroded batteries inside. She tossed them in the trash, and she smiled. "Let's see if I can find some new ones," she said. "You just give me 10 minutes. The rest of the afternoon, he carried it with him everywhere. Sometimes he would record the sound of his own small footsteps on the polished wooden floors. Other times he would record the quiet and very gentle creak of a door. Clara didn't interfere. She only remarked, "Now and then, you can record anything you want, Liam. Sounds, thoughts, ... even silence." And then she had added her own voice, a quiet and very thoughtful whisper. Sometimes silence is the most honest sound of all. That evening, Daniel noticed that Liam was still clutching the recorder at the dinner table. He had raised a single, curious eyebrow. "Did you give him that?" he had asked. Clara had just shaken her head. "No," she had said. "He found it. I just ... I just gave it power late that night." Long after the great old house had gone still, Liam slipped out of his bed. Small black recorder was held close to his chest. He sat on the landing of the grand spiral staircase, a small, solitary figure in the space where the deep and very profound shadows and the dim and very gentle light met. His small finger hovered over the red record button, hesitating for a long, long time. His own small breathing quickened, and then, summoning all of his courage, he pressed it. A small, mechanical click. A few long seconds of a pure and very beautiful silence. And then, very softly, his own voice, a little rough, a little hesitant. but so clear, whispered a single, solitary word. Clara. Clara sank to the kitchen floor, her own knees giving way beneath her. Her own eyes wide as the hot and very beautiful, tears blurred her vision. She covered her mouth, but a small, muffled sob still escaped. It wasn't magic. It was trust. A trust that had been so slowly and so patiently woven, thread by invisible thread, through months and months of a quiet and very persistent and very gentle presence. Daniel had stepped into the kitchen then, and he had frozen when he had seen her, a small, weeping heap on the floor. "Clara," had asked, his own voice anew, and very real and very raw sound of a pure, unadulterated concern. She had just held the small black recorder out to him, her own voice a choked and very emotional whisper. Last night, she had said, he said my name. Daniel had pressed the play button, and when his own son's small, hesitant, but very clear, the voice had filled the silent, sunlit air, he had gone still. A man who had heard countless and very expensive clinical assessments. A man who had, in the deepest and most private parts of his own very broken heart, resigned himself to the thought that his son might never, ever speak again, now stood, silenced by a single, solitary, and very miraculous word. "Jesus," he had murmured, his own eyes now shining with a new and very different kind of a light. It wasn't an accident, Clara had said, her own voice now a little low, but very steady. He knew what he was doing. Daniel had just glanced toward the hallway, picturing his son sitting somewhere, quietly watching. So he had asked, "What do we do now?" "We don't rush it," Clara had replied. "We don't make it into a spectacle. We just keep showing up." And he had nodded, his own hand now holding the small black recorder with a new and very profound and very sacred reverence. The one single word, Clara, was a small and very fragile promise. But it was enough to light up their entire and now very hopeful house. Dinner was no longer something that Daniel had to endure. It became something he looked forward to. Clara would cook with Liam, a small and now very constant shadow right there beside her. Sometimes he would stand on a chair, just to be able to see into the pots. Other times he would crouch on the floor, stacking the spoons or folding the napkins. They didn't speak much, but the quiet, easy rhythm between them flowed effortlessly. And every so often, Clara would hand Daniel a plate, and she would say, "Liam helped with this one." And no matter what it was, it would instantly and very beautifully feel special. One evening, after Clara had left the table to take a phone call, Daniel had stayed behind to clear the dishes. And Liam, he had stood by the sink, holding a small, wet sponge. Daniel had bent down, and he had said nothing, but he had held out his own large hand. And Liam had placed the sponge in his palm, so gently, and then he had walked away in a quiet, comfortable silence. Daniel had kept that one single moment, as if it were a fragile and very precious piece of a hand-blown glass, afraid to break it. Later, as he had passed Clara in the hallway, he had said, almost laughing at himself, "He gave me the sponge." And she had only replied, "That means he is letting you into his world." And Daniel had leaned back against the wall for a long, long while after that, wondering how many other very beautiful things his son had already said to him without ever having to speak. It was the smallness of these moments that made them so unforgettable. Clara never prolonged them. She never tried to give them a deeper, more profound meaning before Liam was ready. She was gentle with him in a way that Daniel was still, and with a great and very humbling effort, learning to be. Daniel began to sit in the same room with them while they played, pretending to read a book or to check his phone, when in truth he just wanted to understand the beautiful and very quiet rhythm that existed between them. Clara had never commented on his new and very constant presence. Only once, without even looking up from her own book, she had said, "You can draw too, you know, even if it's terrible." He had chuckled softly, and he had picked up a crayon, and he had drawn a very crooked and very terrible tree. And Liam, he had glanced over, he had blinked, and then he had handed him a green crayon. Not a word, just a gift. It had almost broken Daniel's heart. That night, Daniel had walked into the living room, expecting the usual, quiet scene. Clara reading a book, Liam playing quietly on the floor. But this time it was different. Clara and Liam were lying on the rug, their heads nearly touching, surrounded by a sea of crayons and sheets of paper that were scattered like a spilled and very beautiful rainbow. And Liam, he wasn't just coloring, he was focused. He was drawing with a careful and very deliberate precision. Daniel had come closer, and he had sat at the edge of the rug, not intruding, just watching. A few minutes later, Liam had looked up, and he had pushed a single sheet of paper toward him. On it were 3 simple stick figures. One tall, medium, and one small. And they were all holding hands. One had long brown hair. One was wearing a tie. And one had a small and very ferocious-looking dinosaur on his shirt. And Daniel had looked at the drawing, and he had felt his own throat tighten. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't detailed. But it was them. It was a family. And for the very first time in so long, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own, and now very beautiful story. Liam had looked at him then, not smiling, not speaking, but just ... staying. And Daniel had felt deep down in his own very broken, and now very healing heart, that he was still and would always be a father. The next day, Daniel had received an unexpected call from a partner in New York. A major project had just been launched, and it would require him to meet with the investors. He hadn't left the state in months, and a cold, hard logic told him that this was an opportunity he should not pass up. While Clara and Liam were rearranging the bookshelf, Daniel had stepped into the kitchen, trying to sound as casual as possible. "I have to go to New York," he had said. "I'm flying out tonight." Clara had only nodded, not asking why. "I will take care of Liam," she had said. And that was the problem. Daniel knew that she would do it well, too well, whether he was there or not. And that had made him feel like he was running away. The afternoon had passed quietly. Liam was less engaged than usual, as if he could sense something. Clara hadn't mentioned Daniel's trip. But when he had come down the stairs with his suitcase, the little boy wasn't in the living room. "He is in the playroom," Clara had said softly. "He didn't want any dinner." Daniel had just nodded and had stepped into the hall to grab his briefcase. When he had opened the outer pocket of his suitcase, a crumpled sheet of paper had been stuck inside. He had pulled it free, and he had unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of an airplane, with bright red flames trailing from its tail. On the ground, a small stick figure stood, its arms raised, its eyes drawn wide with thick, blue tears falling. And beside it, in awkward, childish letters, were just 2 simple words: "Liam sad." Daniel had stood there, frozen. The boy hadn't begged him to stay. He hadn't cried. He had just delivered a message that was sharper and more powerful than any speech. Slowly, he had folded the drawing and had tucked it back into his suitcase. And then, he had carried the suitcase back upstairs. He wasn't going anywhere. Daniel had found Liam curled up in the corner of the playroom, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. The boy hadn't looked up when he had entered, but Daniel had sat down beside him. He had had no speech prepared. He had just spoken the truth. "I was going to leave," he had said. "I told myself it was just for work, but really I was scared. You are making so much progress. You are starting to talk. You are starting to trust. And I didn't know if I could meet you where Clara has." Liam had stayed silent, but he had tilted his head just slightly, and Daniel had met his eyes. "I do not want to be the dad who always leaves," he had said. "Not anymore." Pause. And then the boy had scooted closer, his small shoulder brushing against Daniel's. No words, just a touch. But for Daniel, it was enough. That evening, Daniel had walked into the kitchen while Clara was wiping the counter. "I missed my flight," he had said. She hadn't looked up. "I figured," she had replied. "He has been different since you've sat with him," he had said. "I can't keep running," he had added. This time, Clara had looked at him, not with a surprise, but with something that looked a lot like a recognition. "No," she had said, "you can't." They hadn't exchanged any thanks or any explanations. They had simply stood there, side by side. With a new decision that had been made, he would stay. The next morning, Liam had dashed down the hallway, chasing a crayon that had rolled from his hand. He had moved a little too fast, and his sock had slid on the polished wooden floor, sending him off balance. The thud had come first, and then a short, sharp cry that had sliced like a knife straight into Daniel's chest. He had been in his office, but he had bolted out of it instantly, his own feet barely touching the ground. By the time he had reached him, Liam was curled up, clutching his knee, the tears spilling fast. Hey, you're okay, Daniel?" had murmured, his own voice now unsteady. He had crouched down and had scooped Liam up into his arms, feeling the small and now very safe body trembling hard against him. "Daddy's here," he had said. "I've got you." The words had come out instinctively, without any thought. He hadn't even realized that he had called himself Daddy until Liam had lifted his head, mid-sob his own, small lips trembling. "Daddy," he had said. Daniel had frozen. That single, solitary word, a word he had long since believed was lost too. Him forever had hit him so hard, it had blurred the very edges of everything around him. Did you... did you just... He couldn't even finish the sentence before Liam had tightened his own small hold around his neck. And Daniel had let out a laugh that was tangled with a sob as he had whispered, "You called me. You really called me Daddy." The tears had streamed down his own face then, but this time they were not tears of a pain, were tears of a release. That one single word, Daddy, it wasn't just a title. It was an invitation back in, a passport into his own son's world once more. At the far end of the hall, Clara had stood still, her own hands loosely clasped. She had heard it, but she hadn't stepped forward. This wasn't her moment to enter. She had quietly backed away and had turned into another room, leaving the father and the son together in the pale, beautiful morning light. Daniel had sat down on the floor then, still holding Liam, and had murmured words that didn't even form. Sentences, just sounds to let him know that he was there. Whether Liam spoke again tomorrow or fell silent once more, Daniel knew that something had shifted forever. One single solitary word had just broken through a wall that he had. One's thought was completely and utterly unbreakable. That night the sea breeze was cool, and the sky looked as if it had been dusted with 1,000 tiny shards of a crystal. Daniel was standing on the back porch, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the dark and very peaceful horizon. The steady, rhythmic sound of the waves felt like a giant and very ancient clock, marking time in slow and very deliberate beats. He heard the soft, familiar sound of footsteps behind him and knew instantly that it was Clara. She didn't speak. She just came to stand beside him, close enough to feel her warmth, though their own separate shoulders didn't touch. After a long, comfortable silence, she spoke. "There is a boy," she had said, "that I've never told anyone about. His name was Jordan." Daniel had just tilted his head, and he had waited. "I was his live-in nanny for over a year," she had said. "He was 4, he was bright, he had these curious, beautiful eyes, but he was shy. Then one day he stopped talking. No one knew why. His parents, they believed in acting fast, so they filled his schedule with back-to-back and very expensive therapy sessions and evaluations. He hated all of it. I begged them to just give him some time, to just leave him be for a while. But they didn't agree, and I was let go. I told myself that I would come back to visit him," she had said, and she had drawn in a deep and very shaky breath, still looking out at the dark and very empty sea, but I never made it. Jordan was hospitalized for something else entirely, and he passed away. I wasn't there, and I never ever got to say goodbye. Daniel had stayed silent, but he could hear more than just her words. He could hear the vast, empty space behind them, the kind of a silent and very painful void that he himself knew all too well. And so he had spoken the words, his own very private words, coming out a little low, a little rough. "I know what that feels like," he had said. Clara had turned toward him then, her own beautiful face, now a mask of a quiet and very profound, and very real surprise. Daniel rarely, if ever, spoke about himself, especially not about losing his wife, Sophie. The day Sophie died, he had said, his own laugh a short and very bitter sound, "I wasn't there. She was in a car accident. On her way home from work, they called me when she was already in the ER, and by the time I had gotten there, all that was left was a cold white room, the sharp and very clean. Smell of antiseptic and a single white sheet pulled over her." He had paused, taking a deep and very shaky breath of his own, though his own broad shoulders had stayed tense. "I kept thinking," he had said, "that if I had just left work a little earlier, if I hadn't taken that last and very unimportant client call, that maybe, just maybe, it would have been different. I have lived with that what if." He had finished for 9 long and very empty months. Clara had not interrupted. Her own beautiful gaze held no pity. It held only the kind of a deep and very real and very quiet listening that can make a person feel a little less alone in their own very private story. And so Daniel had gone on. When I saw Liam, he had said, withdraw into his own very silent world, I thought I had to do something, so I called the doctors. I called the specialists. I tried every single solitary therapy I could find. I thought I was fighting for him, but really I was just trying to fix something that was broken, as if a loss, a real and very profound loss, could be repaired by just filling it up with a great deal of an effort. And I had forgotten. I had forgotten that sometimes the only thing a child really needs is for someone to just sit beside them, even when there is absolutely nothing to say. The sea breeze had lifted a single stray strand of Clara's long brown hair, and she had spoken, her own voice now a quiet and very soft and very firm sound. When I first met Liam, she had said, I saw Jordan in him. Not his face, but his silence. The way a child can look straight through you, as if they have already decided that no one can ever truly reach them. And that, ... That scared me. Not because I doubted him, because I doubted myself. I was so afraid, she had whispered, that I would miss my chance to stay. Again. House. Daniel had looked at her for a long, silent moment. You didn't fail, Jordan, he had said, his own voice now steadier than he had expected it to be. You were the only one who truly and completely saw him. Clara's own small smile was tinged with a sad and very beautiful kind of a grace. Being seen, she had said, was never enough. They had said nothing more after that. Above them the night sky was a vast black canvas, strewn with a glittering and very distant dust. And beneath them, the waves had kept their own, steady and very ancient heartbeat rhythm. And they had both known, in that one single solitary moment, that Clara had stayed not to save anyone, but just to make sure that she would never, ever have to turn away again. And for the very first time in months, Daniel didn't feel as if he were standing all alone in the dark in the weeks that followed. Daniel began to show up more in the small, quiet moments between Liam and Clara. At first, he would just linger in the doorway watching as they built their magnificent, very tall Lego towers, or as they colored their beautiful and very imaginative pictures. But gradually, he had begun to sit down beside them, taking a single small puzzle piece, or filling in a small and very insignificant corner of a drawing. And Liam, he hadn't pushed him away. In fact, sometimes the little boy would just place a single small piece in his own large hand, as if he were quietly and very simply saying, you belong here too. One afternoon, Clara had suggested that they should clean out the room that had once belonged to Sophie. Daniel had hesitated. It was the room that had been so firmly and so finally locked for so long. But this time, he had just nodded. When they had opened the door, a thick and very heavy layer of a dust coated everything. But Sophie's own, familiar and very beautiful scent still lingered in the air. Just enough to make Daniel breathe a little deeper and to slow his own very anxious steps. And Liam, he had just wandered in, his own beautiful dark eyes scanning the new and very unfamiliar space, as if he were discovering a new and very magical world. Clara had said nothing. She'd simply picked up a rag, and she'd begun. To wipe, they weren't cleaning to erase. They were cleaning to make it Liam's new room, a place that could still keep the old, beautiful memories, but that would also, and with a new, and very hopeful, and very beautiful grace, allow for the new ones. On the blank white wall, Clara had brought out a box of a bright and very colorful paint, and the three of them had decided to press their own, very different handprints there. Liam had chosen blue, Clara had chosen green, and Daniel had chosen a bright and very hopeful orange. When they had all washed their hands, Liam had picked up a single small crayon and had written one single solitary word just below the three. Bright handprints, family. Daniel had stood still then, and he had stared at it for a long, long time. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't detailed, but it was them, family. And for the very first time in so long, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own. And now, very beautiful story. That evening, the late and very golden sun was pouring through the large living room window, bathing the entire house in a warm and very beautiful gold. Clara was arranging a simple and very beautiful vase of wildflowers on the table, and Liam was sitting beside her with a new and very exciting picture book he had just gotten from the library. Daniel had just walked in, his own strong hands still marked with a little of the paint from fixing the shelves in Liam's new room. No one was speaking, but the quiet and very beautiful peace that now filled the room felt as if everyone, every single one of them, had finally and truly found the place where they belonged. Daniel had sat down next to Liam and had turned the next page of the book. The little boy had leaned his own small head against his father's shoulder. No words were needed. Clara had looked at the beautiful and very simple moment, knowing deep down that her own quiet presence in this house was no longer just a job. She was a part of this now. The quiet and very beautiful and very peaceful silence had stretched out, warm and complete, until Daniel had finally spoken. "Stay," he had said, "not as the help, but as a part of this home." Clara had paused for just a single, solitary breath. But his own steady gaze had not wavered. It wasn't a polite and very empty invitation, and it wasn't an obligation. It was the voice of a man who had finally, and with a great and very real and very beautiful courage, decided not to let the things that truly and deeply mattered ever slip away again. She had smiled then, without a single solitary moment of a hesitation. "I will stay," she had said, "because this is where I belong." And Liam? He had just looked up, his own beautiful dark eyes now brighter than the evening sun, and he had said nothing. He had just wrapped his own small and now very strong arms around both of them. And outside, the waves had kept their own steady and very ancient rhythm against the shore, like a distant and very familiar and very beautiful heartbeat. No one said the word family again. They didn't have to. It was already there, living in every single solitary touch, in every single quiet glance, and in every single beautiful moment where no one had to say a single solitary word.